The alley smelled of rot and wet stone. Hazel pressed herself against the tavern wall, arms full of folded linen, breath shallow in her chest. She had taken the shortcut because the main road was flooded, a river of brown mud swallowing the cobblestones whole after 2 days of relentless autumn rain. The linen was clean. The linen had to stay clean. If she returned to the keep with soiled sheets, the head housekeeper would dock her wages for the 3rd week running, and there was no more to dock. She told herself that was the only reason she stopped. She told herself it had nothing to do with the low, dangerous sound she heard at the far end of the alley. A sound like iron scraping stone, like men who had stopped pretending to be something other than what they were. There were 6 of them. She counted. She always counted. It was a habit born from years of being the smallest person in any room. You counted threats the way other people counted coins. 6 men formed a loose half-circle near the alley's dead end, and they were not ordinary men. Their shoulders were too wide, their movements too fluid, too deliberate. Each one wore a dark cloak stamped with a sigil she didn't recognize. A fractured crescent moon split down the middle, and each one held a blade long enough to mean serious business. The steel caught the pale gray light filtering between the rooftops, and for just a moment, each edge gleamed like a cold smile. And in the center of that half-circle, backed against the stone wall, with his arms loose at his sides and his expression completely, unsettlingly calm, stood the Alpha King. Hazel had seen Ronan twice before, both times from a safe distance. Once across a great hall during the autumn assembly, his broad silhouette cutting through the candlelight, black braids falling past his shoulders like dark water. Once in the courtyard below her window, barking orders at his warriors in a voice that carried through solid walls. Both times she had looked away quickly, the way you looked away from the sun, not from fear exactly, but from the instinctive understanding that some things were not made for staring. Up close, even cornered, even outnumbered, he was overwhelming. He wore his battle leathers, the dark, cross-strapped vest she'd seen hanging in the great hall once, supple black hide reinforced with iron rivets at the shoulders. His fur-lined cloak was gone, likely torn away in whatever had brought him here. A cut ran diagonally across his left cheekbone, thin and still bleeding, a bright line of red against the sharp angle of his face. His blue eyes, pale as winter sky, pale as ice over deep water, moved from man to man with the slow, measuring patience of someone doing arithmetic. He was calculating how many he could take before they took him. 6, Hazel thought. The answer is not 6. Not in a narrow alley with no room to shift, no room to move, and 6 blades already drawn. She should leave. The sensible thing, the only sensible thing, was to set the linen down quietly, back out of the alley and find a guard. Find 20 guards. Send word to the keep and let this become someone else's catastrophe. Her feet did not move toward the alley's entrance. The largest of the 6 men spoke, and his voice was thick with the kind of satisfaction that lived on the wrong side of cruelty. End of the road, King. Your escort is already dead. Your wolf can't save you in this stone box. He tilted his head, and the fractured crescent sigil on his cloak caught the gray light. Kneel. Lord Veth wants a living body, but he didn't say undamaged. Ronan said nothing. His jaw was set like carved oak. His eyes moved again, not desperate. Not afraid, but working. Still working. And then the second man lunged. It happened fast. Ronan caught the blade arm at the wrist, twisted, used the man's own momentum to slam him into the stone wall with a force that sent mortar dust raining from the cracks above. 1 down. But the other 5 closed immediately, pressing in from all sides, and there was simply no space, no room for the enormous, coiled power in that body to do what it was built to do. A blade found his side. Not deep, Hazel thought. She could tell from the way he absorbed it, a tightening of the jaw, a slight drop of the shoulder. But real. Another wound added to the first. 5 against 1, in a stone box. And the 5 were wolves too. Hazel looked down at the linen in her arms. Then she looked at the men. Then, very quietly, she set the linen down against the wall, stepped into the alley, and picked up a loose cobblestone from the ground. A broken chunk of gray rock the size of her fist, left exposed by the flooding. She weighed it in her hand for exactly 1 breath. Then she threw it. Her aim was precise, and absolutely without mercy. The stone caught the rearmost man at the base of his skull with a sharp crack, and he dropped like a sack of wet grain. The remaining 4 spun toward the sound, and found a young woman in a gray wool cloak standing 10 paces back, her golden braid over one shoulder, her hands already searching the ground for a second stone. There was a half-second of stunned silence. "What?" one of them started. "He's not alone," Hazel said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. She held the second stone up where they could see it. "And I throw harder than I look." It was, in the strictest possible sense, a lie. She threw exactly as hard as she looked. That first throw had taken everything she had, but they didn't know that. And in the moment of their hesitation, Ronan moved. She didn't watch what happened next. Not all of it. She caught fragments, the blur of dark leather, the sound of impact, a blade skittering across wet cobblestone, a grunt that ended abruptly. She kept her eyes on the 2 men nearest to her, stone in hand, jaw locked. When it was over, and it was over in seconds that felt stretched thin as wire, only Ronan was standing. The alley smelled of blood and rain. He turned and looked at her. Those pale blue eyes moved from her face to the stone in her fist, to the folded linen she'd left propped against the wall with the careful, slightly absurd dignity of someone who fully intended to deliver it on time. Something passed across his expression that she couldn't name. It wasn't gratitude exactly. It wasn't surprise exactly. It was more like a man who had done very precise calculations and arrived at an answer that didn't fit his equation. "You threw a rock at an assassin," he said. His voice was low and rough, the way stone sounds when it shifts deep underground. "Yes," Hazel said, "to save me. You were outnumbered." A beat of silence. Rain began to fall again, soft and cold, tapping the cobblestones around them. "Who are you?" Ronan asked. Hazel looked down at the linen bundle against the wall, then back up at him. Her heart was hammering so hard she was sure he could hear it. And he probably could, she realized. Wolves always could. "I'm the maid who does the East Wing linens," she said. "And if I don't have those sheets back to the keep in the next 20 minutes, I'm going to lose my position." He stared at her for a long moment. Then, against every expectation she had built about a man like him, the corner of his mouth moved, just slightly, just barely, in something that was almost a smile. "Then we'd better not waste time," he said. "Word count. 32. Percebo que fiquei abaixo do mínimo exigido de 800 palavras. Vou reescrever o bloco 1 completo e expandido agora. Bloco 1. Versão completa." The alley smelled of rot and wet stone. Hazel pressed herself against the tavern wall, arms full of folded linen, breath deliberately shallow. She had taken the shortcut because the main road was flooded. A slow river of brown mud had swallowed the cobblestones whole after 2 days of relentless autumn rain, and the water had crept past the market square all the way to the lower butcher stalls, dark and cold and carrying the smell of old hay and worse things. The linen was clean. That was what mattered. The linen had to stay clean. She had washed it herself, twice, in the stone basin behind the east wing, knuckles raw from the cold water and the rough soap that smelled faintly of ash and pine. She had pressed it flat and folded each piece with the precise, practiced corners that the head housekeeper demanded, the same housekeeper who had docked Hazel's wages twice this month already, once for a wrinkle in the Alpha King's council chamber drapes, and once for a supposed smudge on the hearthstone that Hazel was entirely certain she had not left. A third incident would mean dismissal, and Hazel had nowhere else to go, so she took the shortcut through the alley behind the Greyhorn Tavern. And she told herself that was the only reason she stopped when she heard the sound. A low, metallic scraping. Boots on wet stone. The particular kind of silence men make when they have decided to stop pretending. She counted before she even fully understood what she was looking at. 6. 6 men at the far end of the alley, arranged in a loose half-circle near the dead-end wall. The habit was old. Older than this job, older than this city, born from years of being the smallest person in every room she had ever occupied. You counted threats the way merchants counted coins. Quickly, quietly, before anyone noticed you were doing it. These were not ordinary men. Their shoulders were wrong, too wide, carrying the dense, settled weight of shifted wolves even in human form. They moved with a fluid deliberateness, each footfall placed with the ease of predators who had long ago stopped worrying about being the hunted. Their dark cloaks bore a sigil she had never seen on any of the keep's banners. A crescent moon split clean down the middle, fractured, the two halves pulling apart as though the sky itself had cracked open. Each man held a drawn blade. The steel caught the pale, watery light filtering down between the rooftops, and 6 edges glinted like 6 cold smiles. And in the center of that half-circle, backed against the alley's far wall, arms loose at his sides, face cut and bleeding, stood the Alpha King. Hazel had seen Ronan twice before, and both times from a safe distance. Once across the Great Hall during the autumn assembly, his broad silhouette moving through candlelight, black braids falling past his shoulders like dark rivers, the room seeming to rearrange itself slightly around his presence, the way water rearranges itself around stone. Once from the narrow window of the east wing, watching him cross the courtyard below in the early morning gray, barking short commands at his warriors in a voice that traveled easily through solid walls and 2 closed shutters. Both times she had made herself look away. Not from fear, exactly, but from the instinctive caution of someone who understood that certain things were not built for ordinary looking. Up close, in a narrow alley in the rain, cornered and bleeding, he was still overwhelming. He wore his battle leathers, the dark, cross-strapped vest she had seen hanging on its hook in the Great Hall corridor. Supple black hide reinforced with iron rivets at the shoulders and along the collar. His fur-trimmed cloak was gone, likely lost or torn away in whatever had brought him here to this particular alley at this particular hour. The cut across his left cheekbone was fresh, still bright, running diagonally from just below the eye to the sharp angle of his jaw. His braids were disheveled, several loose strands falling across his face, and his eyes, pale blue, pale as winter sky, pale as the ice that forms over still water at the very first breath of frost, moved from man to man in a slow, deliberate arc, the way a strategist moves pieces across a map. He was not panicking. He was calculating. Hazel understood the calculation. 6 blades, 6 wolves, a stone alley too narrow to shift and too enclosed to run. She could see him working through it the way she had worked through cold mornings with empty pockets. What do I have? What can I reach? What will I do when the first one moves? The largest of the 6 stepped forward. He was built like a cart horse, wide through the chest, neck thick as a timber post, and he carried his satisfaction the way some men carried weapons, openly and without apology. End of the road, King. His voice rolled through the alley like gravel. Your escort is dead. Every one of them. Your wolf cannot save you in a stone box. He paused, letting that settle. Lord Veth wants you breathing. He didn't say anything about comfortable. Lord Veth. Hazel filed the name without meaning to, an old habit from a former life. Ronan said nothing. His jaw was set like carved hardwood, and he did not give the man the dignity of a flinch. The second man lunged without warning. It was fast, faster than humans could follow. But Hazel caught the shape of it. Ronan's hand snapping out to catch the blade arm at the wrist, a brutal twist, Momentum redirected, and the man went into the stone wall with a force that sent mortar dust sifting down from the cracks above like pale gray snow. 1 down. But the other 5 closed immediately, pressing from every angle. And the alley gave no quarter. No room for the coiled, enormous power in that body to do what it was built to do. A blade found his side. She saw the impact in the tightening of his jaw, the slight drop of his left shoulder. Not deep, she judged, but real. She had seen enough wounds to know the difference. Another blade tested his guard from the right, and he deflected it with his forearm at the cost of a long cut across the leather vambrace. 5 against 1. 5 wolves in a stone box, blades already tasting blood. Hazel looked at the linen bundle in her arms. She looked at the men. She looked at the ground, where the 2 days of flooding had worked loose a section of old cobblestone paving near the alley wall, leaving a broken chunk of gray granite the size of her closed fist sitting in a shallow pool of muddy water. She looked at it for exactly 1 breath. Then she set the linen down against the wall, with the careful precision of someone who fully intended to collect it afterward, crouched, picked up the stone, and stood up again. It was heavier than it looked, cold and rough and real in her palm. She could feel the edges where it had broken away from the larger paving stone, sharp in 2 places, worn smooth in 1. She weighted it, corrected her grip, found the angle, and threw it. Her aim did not miss. It never had. Not in 10 years of practice. Not in the circumstances that had made that practice necessary. The stone caught the rearmost man at the base of his skull, with a sound like a wooden mallet striking a post, and he dropped straight down, as though every string holding him upright had been cut at once. The 4 remaining men spun toward the sound. They found a young woman in a gray wool cloak standing 10 paces back in the alley, a long golden braid over one shoulder, her chin level, already crouching to pick up a second stone from the muddy ground. The silence lasted perhaps 2 full seconds. "What in the—" one of them started. "He's not alone." Hazel straightened up, second stone in hand, and looked at them with an expression she had spent years learning to make convincing. "There are 6 of us at the alley entrance. We've been watching since you drew your blades." She paused. "I suggest you think carefully about what you do next." Every word of it was a lie. There was no one at the alley entrance. There were no 6 watchers. There was only Hazel, a pile of clean linen, and 1 remaining stone. But they did not know that. And in the half-second of their hesitation, that crucial, fragile, borrowed half-second, Ronan moved. She did not watch all of it. She kept her eyes on the nearest 2 men, stone raised, jaw locked, because if either of them decided she was bluffing, she would need to be ready. She caught pieces in her peripheral vision, movement like dark water, the hard sound of impact, a blade ringing off cobblestone, a short grunt that ended before it finished. When the alley went quiet again, it went quiet completely. Only Ronan was standing. He was breathing harder now. The cut on his cheek had found a new line of red running down toward his jaw. He stood among the still shapes of 6 men and looked at her across the rain-wet cobblestones, and his pale blue eyes were very still, very focused, and absolutely unreadable. They stayed like that for 1 long moment, the Alpha King in his battle leathers and her in her gray cloak with a cobblestone in her fist, while the rain came down soft and cold around them. "You threw a rock at an assassin," he said at last. His voice was low, rougher than she'd heard it from the courtyard window. The voice of a man who didn't waste words. "You were outnumbered," Hazel said. "You could have run." "Yes." He looked at her for another moment. Then his gaze dropped, briefly, almost imperceptibly, to the neat bundle of folded linen she had propped against the alley wall. "Who are you?" he asked. Hazel lowered the stone. Her heart was beating so hard she could feel it in her fingertips, and she was entirely certain he could hear it. Wolves always could. But her voice, when it came, was steady. "I'm the maid responsible for the East Wing linens," she said, "and if I don't have those sheets back at the keep in the next quarter hour, I'm going to lose my position." The silence that followed was the strangest of her life. And then, against everything she understood about a man like him, against everything the keep's servants whispered about the cold, iron-willed Alpha King who had not smiled since his brother's death 3 winters past, the corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile. Something just beneath one, like a fire catching. "Then, we'd better move quickly," he said. He bent and picked up her linen bundle without asking, tucked it under one arm as though it were a rolled campaign map, and walked past her toward the alley entrance. Hazel stood still for exactly 1 beat, watching the Alpha King of all wolfkind carry her laundry out of a crime scene, rain darkening the shoulders of his battle leathers. Then she followed. She did not yet know that she had just made the most consequential decision of her life. The keep felt different when you walked beside the Alpha King. Hazel had lived within its stone walls for 2 years, and she knew every corridor the way she knew the lines of her own palms, the low archway near the north staircase that caught the wind wrong and always smelled of cold ash, the 3rd step from the bottom that creaked like a wounded animal, the long gallery where the morning light came through the leaded windows in pale gold rectangles that moved across the floor as the hours passed. She had learned the keep the way servants always learned their houses, quietly, invisibly, from the edges. Walking through the main gate beside Ronan was nothing like that. The 2 gate guards straightened so fast, one of them nearly dropped his spear. A stable hand crossing the courtyard with a bucket froze mid-step, water sloshing over the rim onto his boots, and stared with an expression that moved quickly from surprise to something closer to alarm. Because the Alpha King was walking through his own gate with blood on his face and no escort, carrying a bundle of folded linen under one arm, beside a woman none of them seemed to immediately recognize. Then they saw the linen, and confusion deepened visibly on every face they passed. Hazel kept her eyes forward. She had learned long ago that the best way to move through a space without being questioned was to look as though you had every right to be exactly where you were. She walked at Ronan's left shoulder, not quite beside him, not quite behind. The careful distance of someone navigating uncertain territory, and she focused on the cobblestones beneath her boots, and the sound of rain still falling soft against the keep's slate rooftops. They reached the East Wing entrance before anyone found the courage to approach. It was Davan who stepped forward first. Of course it was Davan. The keep's second in command was a tall, lean wolf with close-cropped gray hair and eyes the color of old iron, sharp, watchful eyes that had spent 30 years observing everything and trusting very little of it. He wore his rank in the set of his jaw more than in his dark uniform, and he moved through the keep with the particular authority of a man who believed that order was the only thing standing between civilization and catastrophe. He had never, in Hazel's 2 years at the keep, acknowledged her existence directly. She was, to Davin, part of the furniture. He looked at Ronan's face, at the blood, at the torn leather at his side. Then he looked at Hazel. His expression did not change, but something shifted behind those iron-gray eyes. A rapid internal recalibration, the kind that happened when a known quantity suddenly refused to behave like one. "My lord." His voice was controlled, tight at the edges. "What happened? Where is your escort?" "Dead," Ronan said. The word landed flat and final, as a stone dropped into still water. He handed the linen bundle to Hazel without looking at her. A simple transfer, unhesitating, as though returning something borrowed, and then turned the full weight of his attention to Devon. Greyhorn Alley, 6 assassins, crescent moon sigil, fractured. Find out who they were. Find out who sent them and bring me the answer before nightfall. Devon's jaw tightened. "And your escort, 4 men. I said find the assassins." A pause, brief and final. "Honor the escort afterward. They deserve that." Devon looked once more at Hazel. It was not a friendly look. It was the look of a man mentally filing a piece of information he did not yet know how to categorize. "Yes, my lord," he said, and turned away, already calling for runners. Hazel stood with the linen against her chest and watched Ronan's broad back as he moved toward the keep's inner doors, 2 new guards falling into step behind him from nowhere, materialized like shadows. She became aware, suddenly, of how tired her arms were, of the damp cold working through her cloak, of the fact that her heart had not entirely returned to its normal rhythm since the alley. She turned toward the East Wing stairs. Hazel. Her name in his voice was strange. She had not told him her name. She stopped and looked back. He had paused in the doorway, one hand on the iron door ring, and he was looking at her with those pale blue eyes that gave nothing away easily. "Come to the study after you've delivered those," he said. "3rd floor, north corridor. Someone will be at the door." It was not a question. It was not quite an order either. It lacked the flat command she had heard him use with Devon, with his warriors, with the assembled council. It sat somewhere between the two, in a register she couldn't immediately name. She thought about saying she had other linens to attend to. She thought about saying she was expected in the kitchen corridor. Both things were true. "Yes, my lord," she said instead. She didn't know why. She told herself it was because you didn't say no to the Alpha King. That was true enough to stand on. She delivered the linen. She straightened every fold with hands that were steadier than they had any right to be. She spoke to no one on the way, which was easy because no one on the East Wing corridor spoke to her. Marta, the older laundry maid, was the only one who looked up, and the look she gave Hazel was long and considering in a way that prickled uncomfortably at the back of Hazel's neck. The study was exactly where he'd said. 3rd floor, north corridor, at the end of a passage lined with old maps in heavy frames, ink-drawn territories she recognized only in fragments, pack borders that had shifted and shifted again over generations. A young guard stood at the door, barely older than a boy, trying very hard to look impassive. He stepped aside when he saw her without asking her name, which meant Ronan had already told him to expect someone, which meant he had been certain she would come. She wasn't sure how she felt about that. The study was large and warm. A fire had been built up in the stone hearth, and it threw amber light across the walls of shelved books. Hundreds of them, leather spines cracked with age, some so old the titles had worn completely away. The smell of the room was wood smoke and old parchment, and something darker underneath, like pine resin and cold rain brought indoors. A broad oak desk dominated the center of the room, its surface scattered with maps and sealed documents, and a half-burned candle that had been left to cool in its brass holder. On one corner of the desk, incongruous and faintly absurd, sat a small brown heel of bread on a cloth, as though someone had meant to eat it and forgotten. Ronan stood near the fire. His battle leathers were gone. He wore a plain dark shirt now, laced loosely at the collar, and someone had cleaned and bound the wound at his side. She could see the edge of white linen wrapping beneath the fabric. The cut on his cheek had been cleaned too, but not covered, and it stood out starkly against his skin, a clean dark line still slightly swollen at the edges. He was looking at the fire when she entered. He turned when he heard the door. "Sit," he said, and gestured toward the 2 chairs near the hearth. Hazel sat in the nearer one. The leather was old and soft and warm from the fire. She kept her back straight and her hands folded in her lap, because that was how you sat when the Alpha King told you to sit. She watched him pull the other chair around so it faced her rather than the hearth, and she watched him lower himself into it with the careful deliberateness of a man managing pain he had decided not to acknowledge. The fire cracked softly between them. Outside, the rain had thickened again, and she could hear it against the study's single high window, a steady gray sound. "Tell me," he said, "how a keep maid throws a stone like that." Hazel considered the question. Not the answer. She knew the answer. but how much of it she was willing to give to a man she had met 40 minutes ago in an alley full of bodies. She settled on truth, trimmed to its edges. "I grew up in Fen Crossing," she said, "on the eastern border." His expression shifted slightly. Fen Crossing was a name that meant something to wolves. A contested territory, perpetually argued over by 3 different packs, perpetually dangerous for anyone unlucky enough to simply live there. Most people who mentioned Fen Crossing mentioned it in the past tense. "I learned to throw young," she said. "There weren't always better options." "And when you arrived here?" He leaned forward slightly, forearms resting on his knees. This close, the firelight caught the angles of his face and the pale ice of his eyes, and Hazel found she had to work to keep her gaze steady. "Why keep it hidden? A skill like that is worth declaring." "Skills like that draw attention," she said. "In my experience, attention is not a safe thing to have." He studied her for a long moment. The fire shifted and resettled between them, sending a brief curl of wood smoke toward the chimney. "Lord Veth," he said then quietly. "Do you know that name?" The shift was sudden enough that she felt it, a change in the room's atmosphere like the pressure drop before a storm. She held his gaze. "I heard it in the alley," she said carefully. "One of the men used it. You remembered." "I remember most things." Something moved through his expression again. That same unnameable thing she had seen in the alley, the look of a calculation producing an unexpected result. He held her gaze for a long moment, and Hazel had the strange, unsettling sensation of being read, not her face, but something further in. "Lord Veth," he said slowly, "has been trying to remove me for 2 years, 3 attempts. This is the 4th. He paused. "He almost succeeded tonight. If you hadn't—" He stopped. The sentence sat unfinished between them, and she understood he was not a man who completed sentences like that easily. Outside, the rain fell. Inside, the fire burned. And in the silence of that warm, book-lined study, something shifted between them, small, quiet, and entirely irreversible. "My lord," Hazel said, "may I ask something?" He nodded once. "Why tell me that?" He looked at her for a long moment. "Because," he said, "I owe you the truth, and because Lord Veth knows you were there." His voice was even, but his eyes were not. "Which means you are no longer safe in this keep, not the way you were before." The fire cracked softly. The rain fell. Hazel unfolded her hands in her lap and looked at them, the red knuckles from the cold washing water, the small scar on her right index finger that was older than this city. She had known, somewhere beneath the steady surface she had held since the alley, that this was coming. You did not step into a king's war and step back out unchanged. She had known it from the moment she picked up that stone. She had picked it up anyway. "Then I suppose," she said quietly, "I had better be useful." The rumors reached the kitchen before breakfast the next morning. Hazel heard them the way she heard most things in the keep, without appearing to listen, hands busy with work, eyes on the task in front of her. She was folding dried herbs into small cloth pouches at the long kitchen table, lavender and dried thyme bundled together against moths in the linen chests. And around her the kitchen moved with its usual early morning rhythm. The heavy clang of iron pots, the smell of wood smoke and salted pork, the soft slap of dough being worked on the far counter. The words reached her in fragments, the way fire reaches dry wood, catching here, catching there, until suddenly everything was burning. 6 men dead in Greyhorn Alley. The king's escort, all 4 of them. Someone tried to take him. Someone almost did. That part was expected. What came next was not. They say a woman was with him. A servant. That she fought. Hazel tied a pouch closed and reached for another bundle of lavender. Marta says she saw them come in together. Through the main gate. He was carrying her laundry. The old cook, Bess. A wide, warm woman who had worked the keep's kitchen for longer than most of the stone had been standing, set a heavy pot down near the fire and looked across the table at Hazel with the particular expression of someone who had decided to stop pretending. "You going to tell me it wasn't you?" Bess said. Hazel looked up. "No," she said. Bess studied her for a long moment, lips pressed together. Then she picked up a wooden spoon and went back to her pot without another word. That was Bess. She asked the one question she needed, got the answer, and filed it away somewhere deep and private. She did not gossip. She did not speculate. In 2 years, Hazel had come to trust that about her more than almost anything else in this building. The rest of the kitchen was not Bess. By mid-morning, 3 separate maids had found reasons to pass through the East Wing corridor while Hazel was working, and each one had found a way to linger just long enough to look at her differently than they had the day before. Not badly, not with hostility, not yet, but with the specific, uncomfortable attention of people recalibrating. She had been furniture yesterday. She was something else today. She hadn't decided yet whether that was better or worse. Devon made it worse. He appeared in the East Wing corridor just before the noon bell, hands clasped behind his back, his iron-gray eyes moving over Hazel with the flat assessment of someone conducting an inventory. "The Alpha King has asked that you be moved," he said, without preamble, "to the inner quarters, the guest chamber in the north wing, 2nd floor. Hazel set down the candle she was trimming. "Moved. For your protection." The word protection left his mouth with a very slight but unmistakable inflection. Not quite sarcasm, but the shadow of it, like a bruise beginning to surface. Those were Lord Veth's men in that alley. If they saw your face, this wing is no longer suitable. Those are the king's words. "I understand," Hazel said. Devon did not leave. He stood in the corridor with his hands behind his back and looked at her for a moment longer than the message required. "You've been here 2 years," he said. "Yes. And in 2 years, no one had cause to notice you." It was not a question. Hazel met his gaze and said nothing, which was sometimes the most complete answer available. "I don't know what you are," Devon said quietly. It wasn't an accusation. Or rather, it was the kind of accusation that wore neutrality as a coat. "But I know what I've seen, and what I haven't seen. You came from Fen Crossing. You listed no pack affiliation on your service record. You listed no family." "There was no family to list," she said. "And no pack. And no pack." He looked at her for one more breath. Then he stepped back, the motion precise and deliberate. "Your things will be moved by the evening bell. I'll have someone show you the chamber." He paused in the corridor, half turned away. "Understand me, girl. I have kept this king alive for 12 years. I have buried men who stood where you're standing now and thought they understood the situation." His voice was still even, still controlled, but something underneath it had teeth. "Do not become a complication." He walked away. Hazel looked at the half-trimmed candle in her hand and breathed slowly through her nose until the tightness in her chest eased. She understood Devon. She had known men like him before. Not cruel, not corrupt, but built entirely around a single point of loyalty, and therefore capable of being very dangerous to anything they perceived as a threat to that loyalty. He did not trust her. He would not trust her quickly. And he was not entirely wrong to be cautious. The North Wing chamber was nothing like the small, cold room she'd shared with 2 other maids in the East Corridor. It had a real bed, a wide wooden frame with a proper straw mattress and 2 wool blankets, thick and dark as charcoal, and a small writing table beneath a narrow window that looked out over the inner courtyard. A fire had been laid in the modest hearth, and someone had left a tray. Bread, a wedge of hard cheese, a small pottery cup of water. Simple things, but placed with care. She stood in the doorway for a moment and looked at it. Then she put her small bundle of belongings on the writing table. A comb, a folded spare dress, a leather cord she used to tie back her braid, and one other thing, wrapped in a piece of rough cloth at the bottom of her bag. And she sat on the edge of the bed and pressed both hands flat against the blanket. She did not let herself feel things deeply as a rule. It was a practice, not a nature. Something she had built deliberately over years, because feeling things deeply in uncertain circumstances had a way of making the circumstances more uncertain. But she let herself feel, for just a moment, the particular weight of walking backward out of an invisible life. She had worked very hard to be invisible here. For 2 years, she had been careful, quiet, and precise. She had done her work well enough to keep the position, and not so remarkably as to invite comment. She had made no close friends, broken no rules, attracted no notice. She had built a small, safe, unremarkable existence in the margins of this place. 1 cobblestone, 1 throw, and all of it was simply gone. She took a slow breath, released it, and stood up. There was a knock at the chamber door before she reached it. She opened it to find a boy of perhaps 12 standing in the corridor. A page, by his dark green tunic, holding a folded piece of parchment sealed with a plain wax circle, no sigil pressed into it. He held it out with both hands, the way pages were taught to, and looked somewhere in the middle distance in the way pages were also taught to. She broke the seal. The handwriting inside was heavy and direct. The letters formed with the blunt practicality of someone who wrote as a function of necessity, rather than artistry. Come to the training yard at the 2nd hour past noon. Come alone. Bring nothing. No signature. None was needed. She arrived at the training yard to find it empty of the usual warriors. The space was a wide square of packed earth surrounded by a low wooden fence, weapons racks along the far wall, practice swords, staffs, short hunting bows, a row of balanced throwing knives whose handles caught the thin afternoon light. The sky above was pale and heavy, the clouds the color of old wool, and the air smelled of cold earth and iron and the ghost of old wood smoke from a doused fire barrel in the corner. Ronan was there. He stood in the center of the yard without armor, without his battle leathers, just the dark shirt and plain trousers of a man who had decided to be, temporarily, something other than a king. The bound wound at his side was visible as a slight stiffness in how he held himself, but he stood straight regardless. He was holding 2 wooden practice staffs. He held one out when she approached. Hazel looked at it, looked at him. "You want to see what else I can do," she said. "I want to know what I'm working with," he said. "There's a difference." She took the staff. It was solid, dense wood, well-worn smooth in the grip, balanced toward the center. She turned it once in her hands and felt the weight of it settle into memory. Older memory, deeper than this city, deeper than 2 years of clean linen and careful invisibility. "I'm not a warrior," she said. "I know what warriors look like," he said. "Show me what you are." What followed was not a sparring match in any formal sense. He came at her carefully, testing rather than attacking, the way you tested ice before crossing, light pressure first, then more, watching where it held and where it gave. She found herself responding without thinking, falling back into patterns she had spent 2 years burying beneath routine. She was faster than her size suggested, economical in movement, precise in a way that had nothing to do with training, and everything to do with long practice in situations where imprecision had consequences. She blocked. She deflected. Twice she stepped inside his reach in a way that made him stop and look at her with those pale eyes gone very still. After the 3rd time, he stepped back and lowered his staff. "Fen crossing," he said. "Fen crossing," she agreed. "That's not what they teach in Fen crossing." She held his gaze. "No," she said. "It isn't." The silence stretched between them, not uncomfortable, but full of weight, full of things not yet spoken, full of questions that were beginning to find their shape. The clouds shifted overhead, and the light in the yard changed, thinning to a pale silver that made everything look slightly unreal. "There's a council meeting tonight," Ronan said. "Devon, my war chief Bren, 2 elder representatives. They'll discuss the attack, possible responses." He paused. "I want you there." Hazel felt something go very still inside her. "I'm a maid," she said. "You were a maid," he said quietly. "Yesterday, in that alley, you made a different choice." His eyes met hers, and this time she saw something in them beyond the cool calculation. Something older, something that had been waiting a long time to be relevant. "You can't unmake it. I wouldn't ask you to. But it means something now. What you know and what you can do, and I don't waste things that have value." She thought about Devon, about do not become a complication. She thought about the wrapped object at the bottom of her bag, the one she had carried from city to city and never used, because using it meant admitting she was still the person who had once needed it. "You don't know what you're asking," she said. "No," he said simply. "Not yet, but I will." He tilted his head slightly. "Will you come tonight?" Outside the training yard, somewhere in the keep, the noon bell rolled through the cold air. Hazel looked at the practice staff in her hands. Then she set it back in the rack, carefully, the way you set something down when you intend to pick it up again. "Yes," she said. The council chamber smelled of tallow candles and tension. It was a long, low-ceilinged room on the keep's second floor, accessible through a heavy door banded with iron that Hazel had passed a dozen times in 2 years without ever entering. The walls were stone, hung with faded tapestries depicting hunts and old battles, wolves mid-shift, figures with blades raised, landscapes she didn't recognize. A rectangular table of dark oak dominated the room's center, scarred with old knife marks and the rings left by countless cups, and above it an iron chandelier held 8 candles that threw warm, unsteady light across the faces of the men already seated when she arrived. Devon saw her first. He was seated to the left of the head chair, hands flat on the table, and the look he gave her when she stepped through the door was brief and controlled. A single sharp contraction around the eyes that communicated everything he had already said in the East Wing corridor, compressed into one expression. She held his gaze for exactly a moment, then looked away. Ronan was already at the head of the table. He had returned to his leathers, the cross-strapped vest, the iron-riveted shoulders, and his black braids were pulled back and tied, which gave his face a severity that the loose hair softened. The cut on his cheek had darkened to a thin, bruise-edged line. He did not look at her when she entered, but he gestured with 2 fingers toward the chair nearest the wall, slightly back from the table. Not at it, but not outside it either. A deliberate placement. Beside Devon sat a man she recognized as Bren, the war chief, broad and dark-bearded, with the permanently evaluating eyes of someone whose job required him to assess threats before they fully materialized. Across from him sat 2 older wolves she knew by sight, but not by name. Elder representatives from the northern and western territories, gray-haired and careful, wearing the layered wool cloaks of men who had traveled through the cold to be here. No one introduced Hazel. No one questioned her presence aloud. But she felt the weight of every glance, brief and pointed as needle pricks. Ronan opened without ceremony. 4 members of my escort are dead, he said. Killed in Greyhorn Alley before I reached the secondary gate. 6 assassins, coordinated, equipped with silver-edged blades. He paused to let that settle. Silver edges meant the attack was planned specifically for wolves, specifically for shifting prevention. The sigil was a fractured crescent moon. I need identification. Bren's jaw tightened. Veth's new company, he said, the words carrying the flat weight of confirmation rather than surprise. He's been recruiting outside the Pact territories, men who will take coin over allegiance. The fractured moon is new. Means he's formalized them, Formalized them, the northern elder repeated slowly. That's a significant step. That's not a man who intends to negotiate. Veth has never intended to negotiate, Devon said. His voice was controlled, but there was something beneath it, old and sharp. The question is why he's moved now. 3 previous attempts were subtle. Poison in 2 cases, an arranged ambush in the 3rd. This was open. 6 men in an alley 2 streets from the keep's main gate. He paused. He wants it known. He wants it known, Ronan said, because he's close to something. When men stop being careful, it's because they believe they're nearly done. He looked around the table. What has changed in the last month that would make Veth believe the timing is right? Silence. The candles shifted in a draft from somewhere, and the shadows in the room moved. It was the Western elder who spoke, carefully, like a man placing weight on uncertain ground. The blood treaty, he said. The renewal is in 30 days. If you are dead before it's signed, the treaty dissolves. The northern and western territories revert to contested status. He folded his hands on the table. Veth's ancestral claim covers most of the western border. He has been patient for 6 years, waiting for exactly this window. Hazel watched Ronan absorb this. His expression did not change, but she had spent 2 days now learning the subtle language of his face, the slight tension at the jaw that meant he was processing something difficult, the stillness around the eyes that meant he had already considered this possibility and was now confirming it. Then the timeline is 30 days, Bren said. He'll try again before the signing. He'll try again soon, Devon corrected. He knows the attempt was visible. He knows we're moving now. He'll want to act before we can fully respond. He looked at Ronan. You need to move to the inner chambers. Full escort. No unannounced routes. Agreed, Ronan said. He said it without hesitation, which surprised Hazel slightly. She had expected resistance from a man who walked alone through alleys without a second thought. But he was not reckless. She was beginning to understand. He simply calculated differently than most people. Bren said, We should send riders to the border posts. If Veth is moving his company... He's not only moving his company, Hazel said. The room went quiet. She had not planned to speak. Or rather, she had planned not to. And then the thought had finished forming before she'd finished deciding, and the words had come out with a calm that surprised her almost as much as it surprised the room. Every face turned toward her. Devon's expression was a flat, contained wall. Bren looked at her with the assessing eyes of a man encountering an unexpected variable. The 2 elders exchanged a glance that was too brief to read. Ronan looked at her steadily. He said nothing. He was waiting. Hazel kept her voice even. The fractured crescent sigil. I've seen it before. Not here. At Fen Crossing, 3 years ago. A group of men passing through the eastern border carrying unmarked crates. They stopped at the mill village for 2 nights and left before dawn. She paused. They were moving something. Not weapons. The crates were wrong for weapons. The weight was wrong. And they paid for their lodging with coins stamped with a territorial seal that no longer exists. Veth dissolved that territory in a border dispute 6 years ago. The silence in the room had changed quality. It was no longer the silence of people ignoring her. It was the silence of people listening. Old coins, the northern elder said slowly. Dissolved territory. His eyes had sharpened. You're saying he has assets stored, prepared. This has been planned for longer than the last month. I'm saying what I saw, Hazel said carefully. I don't know what was in the crates, but men who are careful about their sigils and careless about their coins are men who are confident they won't be questioned. That's the behavior of someone who believes the endgame is close enough that the details no longer matter. Another silence. The candles burned. Somewhere outside the keep walls, the wind had picked up, and she could hear it moving along the stone exterior like something looking for a way in. Bren leaned back in his chair and looked at Ronan. The look said something Hazel couldn't entirely read. Part question, part evaluation, part something older and more private. Devon said very quietly, "Who are you?" It was the same question he had asked in the corridor, but it meant something different now. In the corridor, it had been a warning. Here, in this room, after what she had just said, it was a genuine inquiry, reluctant, careful, and entirely real. Hazel looked at him. "I am exactly what I told you," she said. "I grew up in Fen Crossing. I saw what I saw. I remember what I remember." She paused. "I'm not your enemy, Commander." Devon held her gaze for a long moment. Then he looked at Ronan. Ronan had been watching her throughout. His expression had not shifted from that careful stillness, but she caught something in his eyes. A warmth, brief and well-controlled, like a single coal in a bed of ash. He turned back to the table. "We broaden the search," he said. "Bren, riders to every border post, specifically looking for unmarked freight and dissolved territory coins. Devon, I want the Greyhorn Alley bodies examined before burial. The sigil, the blades, any personal marks." He paused. "And I want the records of Fen Crossing for 3 years back. Trade logs, traveler registries, anything filed with the Eastern Border Authority." The Western Elder frowned slightly. Those records would take days to retrieve. "Then start tonight," Ronan said. And the meeting was over. People rose, chairs scraped against the stone floor. The two elders moved toward the door in close conversation, voices low. Bren rolled the map he had spread across the table corner and tucked it under his arm, pausing to look at Hazel once more before he left. A long, measuring look that ended in the smallest of nods. Not acceptance, exactly, but the absence of rejection. Davin was the last to leave. He walked past Hazel without looking at her, which was different from ignoring her. It was the deliberate, considered non-look of a man who had decided not to act on something yet. And then the room was empty, except for the two of them, and the slowly dying candles. Ronan was still at the head of the table, one hand resting on the scarred wood, looking at the map that remained unrolled beneath his palm. The Eastern Territories, she saw. The border regions. Fen Crossing was marked in small ink letters near the right edge. "You remembered those men," he said. Not a question. "I remember everything I'm afraid of," she said. "Those men frightened me. I didn't know why then." He looked up from the map. "And now?" She looked at the ink mark on the parchment, the small, plain letters spelling out the name of a place she had spent 3 years trying to leave behind. "Now I think they were scouting," she said. "Marking resources, routes, people who might be useful later." A pause. "Or people who might be a problem later." Ronan was quiet for a moment. Then, "Is there something you haven't told me yet?" It was a careful question, honest in its carefulness. Hazel thought of the wrapped object at the bottom of her bag. She thought of the name she had not used in 3 years, the other name, the one that belonged to a different version of herself, a version she had folded up and put away the same way she folded linen, with precise corners and careful pressure. "Yes," she said. He waited. "But not tonight," she said. "Not yet." She met his eyes. "When I tell you, I need to know it won't change what happens here." He looked at her for a long moment. The last candle in the iron chandelier guttered and threw their shadows long across the stone floor. "I don't make promises about things I don't yet understand," he said. "But I don't turn away from people who stand in an alley and throw rocks for me either." The faintest trace of that almost smile again. "Tell me when you're ready." She nodded once. It was enough. She walked back to her chamber through the keep's quiet midnight corridors, past the old maps in their heavy frames, and the creaking third stair, and the archway that always smelled of cold ash. Her footsteps were quiet on the stone. Her heart was not. She sat on the edge of her bed in the dark and reached into her bag. Her fingers found the wrapped cloth object without searching. She held it in both hands, without unwrapping it. It was a seal. Small, bronze, the size of her palm. Engraved with a mark she had been born into, and had spent 3 years pretending she could simply leave behind. The seal of a minor noble house in the Eastern Territories. A house that Lord Veth had destroyed 6 years ago. A house whose last remaining heir Veth had been searching for ever since. Outside, the wind moved against the keep's stone walls. Inside, the fire in the small hearth had burned down to orange coals that pulsed softly in the dark, like something still alive, still waiting. Hazel set the seal on the writing table. She did not wrap it again. She told him in the morning. Not immediately. Not at first light. Not with the cold gray dawn still pressing against the window glass and the keep only half awake around her. She waited until the world had fully assembled itself, until the kitchen fires were lit and the smell of wood smoke and salted oats drifted up through the stone corridors, until the courtyard below her window filled with the ordinary sounds of a keep beginning its day. Boots on cobblestone and the distant ring of the blacksmith's hammer starting its morning rhythm. She waited until the world felt solid enough to say a true thing in. Then she picked up the bronze seal from the writing table, put it in her cloak pocket, and went to find Ronan. He was in the training yard again. Alone again, which she was beginning to understand was a pattern with him. A man who surrounded himself with people by necessity and sought solitude by instinct. He was not training this time. He stood at the yard's far fence, looking out over the lower city beyond the keep walls, the gray morning light flat against the angles of his face, his breath a faint mist in the cold air. His black braids were loose today, falling past his shoulders, and he wore a heavy wool cloak, the color of charcoal, over his leathers. He heard her coming before she reached the gate. He always did. He turned and looked at her, and something in his expression changed. A slight opening, a readiness, as though he had been waiting for exactly this and had decided not to say so. She stopped a few paces away and took the seal from her pocket and held it out. He looked at it without touching it. His pale blue eyes moved from the bronze face of the seal to her face and back again, and she watched him read the engraved mark the way a scholar reads a sentence. Carefully, completely, drawing out its full meaning before speaking. "Evander's house," he said quietly. "My mother's house," she said. "I am the last of it." The wind moved through the yard, lifting the edges of her cloak, carrying the smell of pine and cold stone. Ronan was very still. "Lord Evander died 6 years ago," he said, "when Veth dissolved the Eastern claim. The official record says his line ended with him." "The official record was filed by Veth's own chancellor," Hazel said. "My mother took me out of the territory 2 days before the dissolution. She died before we reached the border. She kept her voice steady with the practice of years. I was 22. I had the seal because she pressed it into my hands and told me to keep it hidden and never use it unless I had no other choice." She paused. "I have been making other choices ever since." Ronan reached out and took the seal from her open palm. He held it carefully, the way you hold something that belongs to someone else, respectful of the weight of it. He turned it once, looking at the engraving, then looked back at her. "You are the legal heir to the Eastern border claim," he said. "Yes. Which means Veth is not searching for a political enemy." His jaw tightened slightly. "He is searching for someone whose existence makes his dissolution of the Eastern Territories illegal. Someone who could, before the right counsel, unmake everything he has built in the last 6 years." "Yes," she said again. the silence between them filled with the weight of that. A morning bird called somewhere beyond the keep walls, a single clear note in the cold air, and then was quiet. "He knows you are here," Ronan said. It was not a question. It was the sound of pieces assembling. "The men in the alley, they saw your face." "They did." "Then coming to you is not a separate problem from coming to me." He looked at her steadily. "We are the same problem now, Hazel. The same target." She had known this. She had known it since the night she set the seal on the writing table and stopped wrapping it in cloth. But hearing it spoken aloud in his voice, plain and factual and without flinching, did something to the tightness she had been carrying in her chest for 3 years, loosened it slightly, the way a knot loosens when you stop pulling against it and simply press inward. "I know," she said. "You could have told me this yesterday, in the council meeting." "I could have," she agreed. "Why didn't you?" She looked at him. "Because a room full of men who don't know me yet would have heard Eastern border claim and seen a political complication, not a person." She held his gaze. "I needed you to know first, before it became a strategy." Something shifted in his expression, moved through it like light through water, brief and deep. He looked down at the seal in his hand, then back at her, and when he spoke again, his voice was quieter, stripped of the formal register it usually carried. "My brother died because I trusted the wrong person with the wrong information at the wrong time," he said. It came out simply, without theater, the way old pain sometimes does when it has been carried long enough to lose its sharp edges. "Since then, I have been very careful about what I trust and when." A pause. "You are the first person in 3 years who has made me feel like careful might be the wrong instinct." Hazel held his gaze. Her heart was doing something she did not entirely have language for. "That frightens me," he said. "I want you to know that. I am not a man who frightens easily, and that frightens me." "I know," she said softly. He held the seal out. She took it back. Their fingers did not touch, but the distance between them when she took it was smaller than it had been. They told Davin together. Ronan called him to the study an hour later and laid it out plainly. Hazel's identity, the seal, the legal implications, the connection to Veth's search. Devon listened without interrupting, which she had come to understand was what he did when something genuinely surprised him. He went very still and let it finish. When Ronan finished, Davin looked at Hazel for a long time. His iron-gray eyes moved over her face with the careful attention of a man reconstructing a history he had been given incorrectly. 2 years, he said at last. "You were here for 2 years?" "Yes." "Washing linen?" "Yes." A long pause. "Were you hiding from Veth specifically, or from the situation generally?" "Both," she said. "And from myself, somewhat." Something moved through Devon's expression. Unexpected, quickly controlled, but real. It was not warmth exactly. It was the particular expression of a person recognizing something they had felt before in a different form. He looked at Ronan. "The blood treaty signing," he said. 30 days. If she presents the seal before the assembled pack representatives at the signing. If she makes her claim formally, with witnesses present. "Veth's dissolution becomes retroactively illegal," Ronan said. "His expanded territories, his border claims, his entire political foundation for the last 6 years. All of it built on the premise that Evander's line ended. It didn't." He paused. "It changes the treaty. It strengthens it. Every contested border Veth has been using as leverage becomes invalid." Devon was quiet for a moment. Then slowly, he said, "He will come before then. He cannot allow her to reach the signing." "I know," Ronan said. "We have 30 days to keep her alive and keep him contained. I know." Devon looked at Hazel one more time. This look was different from all the ones before it. It was still careful, still measuring. That would probably never change, she thought. It was simply who he was. But the edge of it had shifted. The hostile suspicion had not disappeared, but had moved aside to make room for something more complicated. "You threw a stone at an assassin to protect a man you didn't know," he said. "And then you came to a council meeting and gave us information that changed the entire picture." He paused. "That is either very brave or very strategic. Can it be both?" she asked. After a moment, something that was almost a smile crossed Devon's weathered face. "In this keep," he said, "that might be the most useful combination possible." Veth moved on the 20th day. He came not with 6 men in an alley, but with 40, coordinated across 3 entry points, at the hour before dawn when the keep's watch rotation changed, and there were 12 minutes of thinner coverage at the eastern wall. It was well planned. It spoke of someone inside with knowledge of the rotation schedule. Devon found the informant on the 19th day, a young gate guard, recently recruited, carrying dissolved territory coins in his boot. Ronan handled it quietly. By the time Veth's 40 men came over the eastern wall, they found a yard full of waiting wolves. Hazel was not in the yard. She was in the keep's great hall, standing before the assembled pack representatives. 8 of them, called 3 days early on Ronan's orders, gathered under the Blood Treaty's emergency provision, holding the bronze seal in both hands. She had dressed carefully, not in her gray wool cloak and plain linen dress, but in a deep green riding dress borrowed from the keep's stores, wool and well cut, with her golden braid pinned at the crown and her back straight, and her voice, when she began to speak, completely steady. She spoke for 20 minutes. She laid out her lineage, her mother's flight, the seal's provenance, the illegality of Veth's dissolution. She spoke clearly and without performance, the way you speak when the truth is sufficient, and ornamentation would only get in the way. 2 of the 8 representatives had known her grandfather. One of them began to weep quietly before she finished. When she was done, the eldest representative, a silver-haired woman from the northern mountains whose opinion, Devon had told her, carried more weight than any formal vote, looked at the seal for a long time. Then she looked at Hazel. "Your house was never ended," she said. "It was only hidden." She paused. "We see it now." Outside, the sound of the brief, decisive conflict in the yard was fading. Veth's men, finding not a sleeping keep but a prepared one, had broken and scattered within minutes. Veth himself, and this Hazel learned later, from Ronan directly, had not come. He had sent his company ahead and waited at the forest edge, and when it became clear the attempt had failed, he had fled north. Bren's riders caught him before dawn at a river crossing. He stood before the assembled representatives 3 days later, and the weight of what Hazel had spoken in the great hall fell on him like stone. His territorial claims, his expanded borders, his 6-year foundation, all of it mapped to a dissolution that had never been legal. There was no violence. There didn't need to be. The law, properly witnessed and properly recorded, was heavier than any blade. He was stripped of his titles and confined to his ancestral lands, a small, cold holding in the far north, under the terms the representatives set. It was not a gentle sentence. It was not meant to be. The blood treaty was signed on the 30th day. Hazel signed it too, not as a maid and not as a symbol, as the legitimate heir of the eastern border claim. Her bronze seal pressed into warm wax beside the marks of 8 pack representatives and the Alpha King himself. Afterward, when the hall had emptied of its formal proceedings and the candles were burning low in their iron stands, Ronan found her at the window at the hall's far end, looking out over the courtyard where the last daylight was pulling away from the cobblestones. He stood beside her. For a while, neither of them spoke. The fire behind them in the great hearth settled with a soft sound, and the smell of wood smoke and old parchment and cold stone filled the silence between them like something comfortable. "What happens now?" she asked, not with fear, genuinely asking. "Now," he said, "is yours to decide." He turned to look at her. "The eastern claim is yours. You can return to the territory, rebuild. You have the legal standing, and you would have the support of the treaty to back it." A pause. "Or you can stay." "Stay?" she repeated. "Here." His voice was quiet. "There is a position that has not been filled since my brother died. Counsel to the Alpha. Someone who remembers everything, who sees clearly, who—" He stopped, breathed. "Someone I trust." She looked at him. The last light from the window fell across his face and caught the pale blue of his eyes, and she thought about a narrow alley and a cold cobblestone and one throw that had changed the entire direction of her life. "Ronan," she said. It was the first time she had used his name without the title. It came out quietly, without ceremony, the way a door sounds when it finally opens after a long time closed. He looked at her. "I'll stay," she said. Epilogue. Winter came fully to the keep 3 weeks later, and with it came snow, deep and white and silent, covering the courtyard cobblestones and the training yard and the rooftops in a clean, even layer that made everything look briefly new. Devon stopped calling her girl sometime in the second week of November. He began calling her by her name with the precise, slightly formal inflection of a man who had decided to mean it. And Hazel understood that from Devon, this was as warm as mountains got, and she received it accordingly. Bren brought her a hunting knife on the day she formally took up the council position. A plain thing, good steel, balanced for throwing. He set it on her writing table without a word and walked away. And she knew it was the most direct compliment she was likely to receive from him, and she kept it. Bess, in the kitchen, said nothing about any of it, and simply began setting aside a portion of whatever was warmest whenever Hazel passed through, as she had done quietly, without announcement, since Hazel's second week at the keep. Nothing changed there. Perhaps nothing needed to. The Eastern Territory began its slow, careful reopening in the new year, overseen from a distance by Hazel, through letters carried by riders. With Ronan's treaty as its backbone and 3 appointed stewards she chose herself. She did not go back. Not yet. Someday, perhaps. But the territory needed time more than it needed her presence, and she had learned enough about roots to know that sometimes the best thing you could do for something damaged was give it room and warmth and leave it to grow. Ronan signed every letter alongside hers. They worked well together, she and the Alpha King, in council, in the study with its fire and its old books and the smell of wood smoke and cold rain, in the quiet spaces between the day's demands when they sat near the hearth without speaking, and the fire burned and the snow fell outside, and the world was, for a time, exactly the size of that warm room. She had not known, before this, that safety could feel like a presence rather than an absence, like something real, something with weight and texture and warmth that you could lean against. She had not known a great many things before the alley, before one throw, before one decision to put down the clean linen and pick up a stone. She did not regret it. She had spent years being very good at disappearing, and she had discovered, late and all at once, that she was also very good at being found. One evening in deep winter, snow pressing soft against the study window and the fire high in the hearth, Ronan looked up from the map he was reading and watched her for a moment. Just a moment, quiet and unhurried. "You know," he said, "you were the most expensive laundry maid this keep has ever employed." Hazel looked up from her letter. "The clean sheets were returned on time," she said. "I believe that was the original arrangement." He smiled. Not the almost smile, not the trace of one. A real, full, rare thing that changed his entire face and made him look briefly, like someone who had not been carrying the weight of a kingdom and a dead brother and 3 years of grief. She smiled back. Outside, the snow fell on the keep's old stone walls, soft and white, and entirely indifferent to kings and maids and bronze seals and the small, irreversible moments that change everything. The fire burned. The wind moved gently past the window. And inside that warm, book-lined room, 2 people who had both spent a very long time being alone finished their work side by side in the comfortable silence of people who have, at last, found exactly where they are supposed to be. The story had no loose threads left to pull. It was simply, finally, done.